The night Nathan Voss drove home from the airport, he almost didn't see her. It was past 11, the kind of November in Winnipeg that doesn't apologize. The wind coming off the prairie flat and mean, the rain turning to sleet somewhere between the highway and the city limits. Nathan had been in Toronto for 3 days of board meetings that went nowhere and cost him a great deal of money in aspirin. He was tired in the specific way that had nothing to do with sleep. He wanted his kitchen, his silence, his glass of scotch left breathing on the counter. That's when the headlights caught her. A woman, maybe mid-30s, pulling a rolling suitcase down the shoulder of Portage Avenue. No umbrella. The sleet plastering her hair to her face. She wasn't running. That's what struck him first. She was just walking, head down, like she'd already made her peace with being cold. Nathan slowed without deciding to. He rolled down the passenger window, and the sleet came in immediately, speckling his leather seat. The woman, startled, gripped the handle of her suitcase, took one step back. He understood. A man in a black Audi at 11 at night, offering a ride. He would have been suspicious too. "I'm not." He stopped. "Started again. There's a Tim Hortons about 4 blocks up. I can take you there, just out of the rain." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down the road in both directions, as if calculating something. Then she looked back at him. "Okay," she said. Her name was Frances Beaumont. She told him that once she was in the car and the heat had come up and she'd stopped shivering enough to speak clearly. She was a home support worker. Her shift had ended at 9, but her client had fallen and she'd stayed until the paramedics came. And while she was in the hospital waiting room making sure the old woman had someone with her, her bus pass expired and she'd missed the last 21 Portage. She said all of this matter-of-factly, like it was just logistics, not like it was her night falling apart around her. Her daughter was at home, she added, 7 years old, with a babysitter who charged by the hour. Nathan said nothing. He drove past the Tim Hortons. She started. "I'll take you home," he said. "Where do you live?" Another long pause. "St. James, off Empress." "That's fine." She held the suitcase handle in her lap the whole way, her knuckles pale. He didn't try to make conversation. He just drove. At one point his phone lit up. His assistant, probably, or his CFO, and he turned it face down on the console without looking at it. He pulled up in front of a small 2-story on a street where most of the porch lights were off. Frances Beaumont thanked him in the quick, efficient way of a woman who doesn't ask for much and therefore doesn't know how to receive it gracefully. She was out of the car before he'd fully stopped. He watched her go up the walk. The light came on inside. He drove home. He didn't think about it again. That was an honest thing he could say about himself. He genuinely didn't think about it again. He had quarterly projections to review and a merger that was unraveling in Vancouver and a fundraising gala his communications director had put on his calendar in red, meaning he couldn't cancel it. The night on Portage Avenue filed itself away somewhere quiet and stayed there. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, Nathan's assistant Margot brought him a letter. Not an email. A letter in an envelope addressed to the company in a handwriting that used careful block capitals, like someone who had learned that their cursive wasn't easy to read and had adjusted accordingly. Margot set it on his desk with the slightly raised eyebrow she reserved for things that fell outside normal parameters. Nathan almost didn't open it. He opened it. "Dear Mr. Voss," it read, "you probably don't remember me. You gave me a ride home in the rain on November 14th. I've been trying to write this for a few weeks because I wanted to say thank you properly, but I kept not knowing how. My daughter Isla asked me why I was crying at the kitchen table, and I told her a stranger had been kind to me. She said she wanted to draw you something. I told her that was a good idea. She drew it herself. She is 7 and very serious about her drawings. I hope that's okay. Yours truly, Frances Beaumont." The drawing was on a folded piece of construction paper, a blue car, recognizably an Audi, which surprised him in the rain, with yellow lines for the rain. Inside the car, 2 stick figures. One had a briefcase, one had a suitcase with wheels. Both of them were smiling, and a child's careful, enormous handwriting at the bottom. "Thank you for being nice." Nathan sat with it for a longer time than he would have admitted to anyone. He set it on his desk. He went back to his projections. That evening he moved the drawing to the corner of his desk where he kept the things that weren't work: a photo of his father, a small piece of petrified wood from the Badlands, a cup he'd won in a curling bonspiel in 2019 and kept because his team had found it funny. The drawing stayed there. Margot tracked down an address through the agency Francis worked for, which Nathan had also looked up in the letter's postmark details and cross-referenced, which he would also never admit to anyone. He sent a thank you note back, short, 3 sentences, professional in tone, because that was the only register he had for personal correspondence, and included a gift card for a restaurant on Corridon that he liked, and then felt immediately that this was wrong, that a restaurant gift card sent by a man in an Audi to a woman who'd walked home in the sleet was exactly the kind of thing that lands badly regardless of intent. He didn't know why he kept thinking about this. He was 41 years old. He ran a mid-sized logistics company with 230 employees. He had an ex-wife in Ottawa with whom he was on pleasant, distant terms and no children, and a life that had organized itself around work so gradually that he hadn't noticed it happening until it was already done. He had friends in the way that successful men have friends, people he liked, with whom he had drinks occasionally and talked about things that were never quite real. He had a routine that worked. He did not have, and had not in some time had, the particular feeling of being surprised by something. Francis Beaumont's letter surprised him. Not the gratitude. That he understood. People were grateful for small things, and that was reasonable. It was the daughter. It was she told a stranger had been kind to me. It was the fact that this woman had sat at her kitchen table and cried over it, and her 7-year-old had seen and wanted to do something about it. There was a whole life in that image that Nathan couldn't stop turning over in his mind, the way you turn something smooth and heavy in your hand without quite knowing what you're looking for. He did not send the gift card. He wrote a different note. He said the drawing was hanging in his office. He said he hoped her client had recovered. He said in the merit, and this was the part he rewrote 4 times, that if she ever wanted to have coffee sometime, he would like that. He left his personal number. He put the letter in an envelope. He addressed it. He left it on his desk for 2 days, then gave it to Margot to mail before he could reconsider. She called on a Thursday afternoon, which was the one slot in his week where his calendar was theoretically clear and almost never actually was. He was standing at the window looking at the construction on Graham when his personal cell lit up with a number he didn't know. He answered. "It's Francis Beaumont," she said, "from the rain." He almost laughed. "I remember." A pause. Then, "I wasn't sure if you meant the coffee or if you were just being polite." "I meant it." Another pause, shorter. "Okay, when?" They met at a place on Osborne, not somewhere Nathan usually went, which was intentional, because he didn't want to be somewhere he was known and have to explain a thing he didn't yet have words for. Francis arrived 4 minutes after him, in a coat that was too light for December, but looked like it had been recently ironed. She shook his hand with the directness of a person who'd decided not to be nervous and was executing that decision. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. He knew this because he had a 4 o'clock and he watched himself miss it without intervening. She told him about her work, not the way people describe jobs, but the way people describe the thing that keeps them making sense of their days. Her clients were mostly elderly, living alone, some of them sharp as anything and some of them fading, and what she did, she said, was make sure they didn't disappear before they had to. That was how she put it. He asked what she meant. She said, "When someone has no one to notice whether they ate, or whether they slept, or whether they're in pain, they start to not bother noticing themselves. You have to be the person who notices, so they remember they're still here." Nathan was quiet for a moment after she said that. She looked at him like she thought she'd said too much. "My father was in care for the last 8 months of his life," he said, "in Selkirk. I visited on weekends. There was a woman there, not a nurse, just someone who came in mornings, and she always knew exactly how he was, not from the chart, just from looking at him." He stopped. "I always thought about that." Frances looked at her coffee. "That's what the work is," she said simply. He drove her home. He didn't go past her house again this time. He said goodbye properly at the curb in the cold, and when he pulled away he felt the specific lightness of a thing he hadn't known was heavy becoming slightly less so. They had coffee 3 more times before Christmas, and each time Nathan found reasons why this was logistically manageable. She worked days, he had evenings. Winnipeg was small enough that distance wasn't an obstacle. He was very good at logistics. It was also true that he was using logistics to avoid the simpler and more accurate statement, which was that he was looking forward to seeing her. He met Isla on the 4th coffee, which became instead a trip to the Forks Market because Isla had a school project about the fur trade and Francis had asked, apologetically, if he minded. He said he didn't mind. He hadn't been to the Forks in years. Isla was small and precise, with her mother's dark eyes and a notebook in which she wrote things down as they walked. She regarded Nathan with the frank assessment of a 7-year-old who has decided to form her own opinion independently of whatever her mother thinks. She shook his hand when they were introduced. She asked him within the first 10 minutes what he did for work. He told her he moved things from one place to another. She thought about this. Like furniture? More like medicine, food, equipment, things people need. She wrote something in her notebook. He didn't ask what. At one point they stopped in front of a display about York boats and Isla read the information panel aloud, carefully, checking each word before she said it. Francis stood beside Nathan while this happened and neither of them spoke. He was aware of her shoulder near his arm. He was aware of the specific ordinary warmth of it, standing in a museum on a Saturday afternoon while a child read about boats, and how it was the kind of ordinary he had not been inside for a long time. When Isla finished reading, she turned to Nathan and said, "Did you know that the voyageurs could paddle for 16 hours? "I didn't know that," he said. She nodded seriously. "That's a long time." "It is." She went back to her notebook. Francis glanced at him sideways, not quite smiling but close, and he looked away at the York boat display so she wouldn't see what was on his face. January brought a cold snap that Winnipeg accepted with the resigned pragmatism of a city that has been through worse. Nathan had a difficult month. The Vancouver merger finally collapsed, taking with it 3 months of legal fees and a partnership he'd believed in, and he spent most of January eating lunch at his desk and arriving home to a quiet apartment that had always been quiet but now felt louder somehow about it. Francis texted on a Wednesday. "Rough week?" He hadn't told her anything. He replied, "How can you tell?" She sent back, "I notice things. It's the job." He smiled at his phone in the empty apartment. He was 41 years old and he was smiling at his phone in the dark. They had dinner that Friday, just the two of them, because Isla was with Francis's sister in Transcona. They went somewhere nice, nicer than Nathan meant to suggest, but the word was already out before he recalibrated, and Francis came in a dress that was clearly not something she wore often, which made him feel both touched and guilty for the nice restaurant. He said something about this, awkwardly. She said, "Nathan, I own a dress. Relax." Over dinner she told him about her marriage, which had ended 4 years ago, without drama and without particular bitterness. Her ex-husband was a decent man, she said, who had wanted a different life and had eventually admitted it, and the honest admission had made the ending something she could respect even if she hadn't chosen it. She shared custody with him. Isla spent every other weekend in Brandon. He told her about his own marriage, which had ended 6 years ago and which he was less able to describe without a kind of blankness settling over him, because the truth was that it had ended not because anything went wrong, but because nothing had been very right for a long time, and they had both been busy enough not to notice until they couldn't pretend not to anymore. His ex-wife, Caroline, was a precise and capable woman who deserved someone who came home thinking about her. He had never come home thinking about her. He had come home thinking about her. "Is that different now?" Francis asked. He looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said, "it's different now." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked down at her wine, and there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Walking back to her car, she stopped on the sidewalk and turned to him and said, "I want to say something and I need you to not make it weird." "Okay." "I was afraid of you at first. Not afraid of you, afraid of this, of whatever this is. Because the last time I let myself into something I didn't understand the shape of, I had to explain to my daughter why her father moved to Brandon." He waited. "But Isla asked me last week if you were going to come to her school concert," she said, And I didn't know what to answer, and she said, Francis stopped, started again. She said, he's the nice man who has my drawing. That's how she thinks of you. And I realized that I trust her about people. She's usually right. The street lamp made the sleet silver. Nathan's throat was doing something he wasn't going to examine closely. I would like to come to the concert, he said. She laughed, surprised into it, quick and real, the first time he'd heard her laugh like that. It's recorder music. It's not going to be good. I don't care. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched his arm, just briefly, coat to coat, nothing significant, and said goodnight and walked to her car, and he stood on the sidewalk in the Winnipeg sleet watching her go and felt something in his chest that he recognized, distantly, as something he'd stopped expecting. The concert was in February, in a gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and paper decorations, and Nathan arrived early and sat in a folding chair in the third row next to Frances and her sister Denise, who assessed him openly and without apology throughout the opening remarks and then, apparently satisfied, offered him half her granola bar. Isla's class played hot cross buns and a simplified version of O Canada, and something that was ostensibly Twinkle Twinkle but required some interpretive generosity. Isla was in the second row. She spotted Nathan as soon as the class filed in, and her face did something careful and controlled, the way a child's face does when they've been told not to wave but want to. He gave her a small nod. She gave him a small nod back. After, in the crowded gymnasium, she came and stood beside him and said, "Did you see me?" "Second row," he said. "You counted in." She looked at him with open satisfaction. "Most people don't notice that." "I notice things," he said. "It's something I'm working on." She considered this. Then she put her hand in his, briefly, the way small children sometimes do. Not because they mean something by it, but because a hand is there and hands are for holding, and then she let go and went to find her grandmother. And Nathan stood in the gymnasium with the ghost of that small hand in his and tried to remember the last time anything had felt so completely, quietly important. Spring came slowly, the way it always does in Manitoba, apologetically and in stages. Nathan found himself rearranging his Tuesdays and his Thursdays. He came for dinner at Frances's house on Emperor Street with increasing frequency, eating at a kitchen table where Isla's artwork covered the refrigerator and someone always forgot to replace the paper towel roll. He drove them to Bird's Hill on a Saturday in April when the snow had finally admitted defeat, and Isla ran ahead on the trail and narrated everything she saw in a continuous commentary that neither of them was required to respond to, but both of them listened to anyway. He told his CFO, Stefan, over lunch in March, that he was seeing someone. Stefan asked who. Nathan described her. Stefan, who was direct in the Albertan way that Nathan usually found useful, said, "She sounds like someone who keeps you honest." "She does," Nathan said. "Good," Stefan said. "You needed that." Nathan did not argue with this. What he hadn't expected, the thing none of his prior experience had prepared him for, was not the relationship itself, but the texture of it. The way Francis would fall asleep on his couch reading on Sunday evenings and he would turn off the lamp and feel no urgency to leave. The way Isla, now 8, had begun occasionally calling him by name in the middle of a sentence. "Nathan, did you know?" The same way she'd say Mum or Aunt Denise, as if he'd simply become someone she expected to be there. The way ordinary things, grocery runs, hockey on television, a flat tire in a Canadian Tire parking lot on a frozen Tuesday, had started to feel like they happened inside something rather than outside it. He had not understood, before, the difference. He understood it now. It was Isla who said it first. They were driving back from Ile-des-Chênes in the early evening, Isla in the back seat with her notebook, Frances in the passenger seat with her shoes off, and Nathan watching the highway go flat and golden ahead of them. Isla had been quiet for a while, which was unusual enough to be worth noticing. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah. If we lived with you, would you be our family?" Frances turned in her seat. "Isla." "I'm asking," Isla said, in the reasonable tone of a child who understands she has asked a real question and is prepared to wait for a real answer. Nathan kept his eyes on the road. His hands on the wheel were very steady. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what I be." He heard Frances breathe beside him. Not a sound, just an exhale, small and careful, like something settling. Isla went back to her notebook. They drove in silence for a few minutes. The sun was doing something generous with the fields outside Ile des Chines, the way Manitoba light does in May, making everything look briefly like it belongs in a painting. Nathan thought about his office, about the drawing in the corner of his desk, the blue Audi in the yellow rain, the two stick figures smiling. He had moved it twice over the past months to keep it out of the way of meetings. He had never considered removing it. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. He was talking to Frances, but he hadn't quite turned to look at her. "Nathan," she said softly. "I rehearsed this," he said. I had a thing. It was very organized, bullet points." "Of course you did. None of it seems right now." "Then don't use it." He glanced at her, quickly, the way you check something precious in passing because looking too long feels like pressing on a bruise. "I want to be the person who notices," he said. "For both of you. If you'll let me." Frances was quiet for a long moment. In the back seat, Issa was very pointedly writing in her notebook and absolutely listening to every word. "That's a yes," Frances said, "in case you needed me to say it out loud." He reached over and took her hand. She turned his over and held it the way she held things, carefully, like she knew the weight of them. Isla's voice came from the back seat. "Are you going to kiss?" "Isla." "I'm just asking." "Mind your notebook." "I'm minding it," Isla said, in a tone that made entirely clear she was doing no such thing. Nathan laughed, properly the way he'd been working on, and the Manitoba highway unrolled ahead of them, flat and gold and going somewhere that, for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt like it was his. "I keep thinking about the drawing. A blue car in yellow rain, two stick figures both smiling. A 7-year-old made it because her mother came home one night and cried at the kitchen table. Not from exhaustion, not from the missed bus or the cold or the long shift, but because a stranger had been decent to her. That was enough to bring her to tears. That tells you something about how rarely it had happened. What Nathan did that night on Portage Avenue wasn't remarkable by his own measure. He pulled over. He drove someone home. He was warm and she was cold and he had a car. The logic of it to him was simple. But I think that's exactly the point. Decency doesn't announce itself. It doesn't calculate whether the moment is worth the effort. Nathan wasn't thinking about what he might gain. He wasn't thinking at all, really. He just saw someone who needed help, and he helped. That's what it looks like when goodness has been practiced long enough to become instinct. And there's a kind of intelligence in that, too. Not the kind you put on a resume, but the kind that reads a situation and understands what it actually requires. He knew not to say too much. He knew not to make it uncomfortable. He drove past the Tim Hortons because he'd already understood that what Frances needed wasn't a coffee, it was to get home to her daughter. He noticed, and noticing, I've come to believe, is one of the most underrated things a person can do for another. Frances has it too, that quality. She'd built a whole career around it. She noticed when her elderly clients were fading, not from a chart, but from something quieter, a shift in the way a person holds themselves when they've stopped being sure anyone is paying attention. She spent her days being the person who paid attention, and then she walked home in the sleet because she'd stayed late to make sure an old woman wasn't alone in a hospital waiting room. She didn't make a thing of it. That's what made it real. And Isla, small, precise, serious about her drawings, she understood something her mother and Nathan were still working out. She didn't need to analyze the situation or weigh the risks. She just asked the honest question, plainly, in the back seat on the highway. If we lived with you, would you be our family? Children cut through to the truth that adults spend months circling. She had the clarity that the rest of us have to work to recover. I think about how Nathan described his life before that November night, organized, functional, productive, and quietly hollow. He'd built something real but had no one to come home thinking about. That's not a small thing to admit. It takes a particular kind of honesty to look at a life you've constructed carefully and say, this is not quite right, and then when something better appears, to not talk yourself out of it. What I take from this story isn't that kindness gets rewarded, though sometimes it does. It's that kindness keeps you open. It keeps you the kind of person things can still happen to. Nathan stopped that night not because he expected anything. He stopped because he was, at his core, someone who still noticed other people. And because of that, he was still reachable, still available to be surprised. That's what I want to hold on to. Not a rule, not a guarantee, just a reminder that who we are in the small, unwitnessed moments is the same person who will or won't be there when something real comes along. Nathan was there, and so, it turned out, was everything else.